The marble steps of the
Get
Kang
out
mansion
and
had
never
never
come
looked so
back!
cold. Amara Bennett stood at the top of them, rain soaking through a plain
Take it
beige dress,
and never
one
come
crumpled
back!
$100 bill pressed against her chest like it was the only thing keeping her heart inside her body. Beside her stood a stranger in a filthy black hoodie, hands stained with dirt, eyes calm in a way that made no sense for a man who looked like he belonged under a bridge. Above them, under a chandelier dripping gold light onto the storm outside, Madame Kang pointed a manicured finger at Amara's face and screamed the words that would end one life and begin another. Behind her, Su Min laughed, clutching a designer bag, delighted by a cruelty she had been raised to enjoy. What none of them knew, what not even Amara knew yet, was that the quiet, filthy man standing beside her, the one Madame Kang had just paid $100 to make her disappear, was about to become the most powerful person in Seoul. And the woman pointing her finger so confidently down those marble steps was about to learn that some mistakes cannot be bought back for any price. Before we go further, if you were Amara, standing on those steps, humiliated in front of the family that was supposed to love you, would you have run? Or would you have stayed to find out the truth? Tell us in the comments, and let us know which city you're watching from tonight. It always amazes us how far these stories travel. The morning it all began had looked deceptively ordinary. 6 hours earlier, the Kang mansion had smelled like fresh jasmine tea and old money. Amara woke before sunrise, the way she always did in the narrow servant's room at the back of the third floor, a room with no view, no heating in winter, and a single photograph taped above the bed. In it, a younger, laughing version of her mother stood in a Seoul market, her dark skin glowing under string lights, her arm wrapped around a much younger Amara. Amara touched the photograph every morning before her feet hit the floor. It was a ritual, a quiet promise that she was still someone's daughter, even if the rest of the house had long forgotten it. By 6, she was already in the kitchen, arranging Madame Kang's imported Darjeeling on a silver tray exactly the way she liked it, never touching the rim, never letting the spoon clink twice. Suman's grapefruit had to be peeled without a single strand of pith left behind, or breakfast would be sent back untouched, and Amara would go hungry until dinner as punishment. She never argued. She had learned over 8 long years that silence was survival. Her father, Mr. Bennett Kang, rarely looked at her anymore. When she was a child, he used to lift her onto his shoulders in the garden and tell her she had her mother's eyes, sharp, warm, unshakably kind. Now he passed her in the hallway the way a man passes furniture, something familiar, something he no longer noticed. Madame Kang had orchestrated that erosion piece by piece. First, she convinced him that Amara needed structure, extra chores to build character. Then she quietly moved Amara's trust documents into a locked drawer in the study, claiming she was simply protecting a grieving motherless girl from predatory relatives. Then came the isolation. Cousins uninvited from holidays, calls from her mother's old friends mysteriously never reaching her. Piece by piece, Amara had been erased from a life that once belonged to her. There were smaller cruelties too, the kind that never made it into any story because they seemed too petty to mention out loud, yet accumulated like sediment at the bottom of a riverbed. Madame Kang would introduce Amara to guests as the housekeeper's daughter and let the silence do the rest of the damage. Su Min would leave her closet doors open on purpose, letting racks of untouched silk dresses spill into the hallway Amara had to clean, a museum exhibit of everything Amara wasn't allowed to want. On her birthday every year, a small parcel would arrive from an unknown sender. No note, no return address, just a modest gift wrapped with careful hands. Amara suspected, though she could never prove it, that it came from someone on her mother's side of the family that Madame Kang had long since cut from the guest list. She kept every wrapping paper in a shoebox beneath her bed, the closest thing she had to evidence that somewhere out there, someone still remembered she existed. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself that if she was patient, if she worked hard enough, proved herself loyal enough, her father would eventually see her again. Love, she believed, could be earned back like a debt repaid in small installments. She was wrong, and that morning, cleaning the crystal in the drawing room, she overheard the conversation that proved it. "She's asking questions again," Madame Kang murmured into her phone, voice low, eyes flicking toward the closed door. "About her mother's accounts. I told you this day would come." A pause. Amara's hand froze mid-polish. "No, she hasn't found anything, not yet." Another pause, longer this time. But if she does, everything falls apart. The company, the trust, all of it. I need this handled before she starts talking to lawyers. Amara's pulse thudded so loud she was sure the whole house could hear it. She set the crystal down without a sound and slipped away before Madame Kang turned around. That night, unable to sleep, she did something she had never dared to do before. She crept into the locked study while the house slept, using the old key her mother had once hidden inside a hollowed-out hymn book. A book Amara had kept for exactly this kind of desperate moment. Inside a drawer beneath decades of tax filings, she found them. Documents with her mother's signature, a trust fund, shares in an international investment firm called Sylvain Capital, structured under Amara's name, not Su Min's, a fortune large enough to make the entire Kang estate look like pocket change. Her hands trembled as she read line after line. Her mother hadn't just been a housewife who married into money. She had built something, and every bit of it, legally, undeniably, belonged to Amara. She didn't hear the study door creak open behind her. "Interesting reading," said a voice like ice cracking over a lake. Amara turned. Madame Kang stood in the doorway, her silk robe glowing faintly under the hallway light, her expression calm in the terrifying way of someone who had already decided your fate. "You shouldn't be in here," Madame Kang said softly, stepping into the room, closing the door behind her with a click that echoed louder than a slammed door ever could. "Some doors, Amara, are locked to protect you from the truth. Or to protect you from me," Amara whispered. Something flickered behind Madame Kang's eyes, not anger but calculation, the look of a woman rearranging a chessboard in her head. "Get some sleep," she said finally, plucking the documents from Amara's hands with practiced gentleness. "We'll discuss this tomorrow as a family." Amara didn't sleep. She lay awake, staring at her mother's photograph, wondering if she had just made the worst mistake of her life. She had. The next morning arrived with false calm, the kind that exists only in the eye of a storm. Madame Kang wore green silk and a smile carved from marble. Su Min wore gold and impatience. Amara's father was, conveniently, away on business. A phrase Amara had learned meant he simply didn't want to be present for whatever was coming. "You'll be doing a small job for us," Madame Kang announced over breakfast, not looking up from her tea. "Outside the city, a family friend needs help for a few days. The car will take you this afternoon." Amara knew, with the clarity of someone who had just read her own death warrant, that there was no family friend. But refusing would only speed up whatever was already in motion. So she nodded and packed a single bag and told herself she would find a way to survive whatever came next. By evening, rain had swallowed the city whole. The black car that picked her up didn't take the highway out of Seoul. It wound instead into the narrow, half-lit alleys near an abandoned railway line, where the streetlights flickered like dying stars, and the buildings leaned close together like conspirators. The driver stopped. He didn't turn around. "Get out," he said. "What? Where's the—" "Get out." She stepped into the storm and the car pulled away before she could even close the door, leaving her alone in the freezing dark, her single bag soaked within seconds. She turned, and that was when she saw him. A man sitting beneath a broken umbrella against a concrete wall, wrapped in a filthy hoodie, dark hair plastered to his forehead, eyes closed like he'd made peace with a life the world had discarded. Behind her, headlights. A second car she hadn't noticed pulled up. A man in a dark suit stepped out, opened an envelope, and pressed it into the seated stranger's hand without ceremony. "She's yours now," the driver said flatly, and left, tires hissing against wet asphalt into the dark. Amara stood frozen, rain running down her spine, staring at the envelope in the stranger's hand. He opened it slowly. Inside, a single $100 bill. She had just been sold. For $100. By her own stepmother. The stranger looked up at her for the first time, and his eyes, tired, unreadable, ancient in a way that didn't match his face, studied her like he was reading a language only he understood. "If you want to survive tonight," he said quietly, "trust me." She laughed, a broken, disbelieving sound. "Trust a man my family just paid to make me disappear?" "They didn't pay me to hurt you," he said, standing slowly, brushing rain from his sleeves. "They paid me to take you somewhere you'd never be found." "That's not comforting." It wasn't meant to be. He tilted his head toward the end of the alley. But we don't have time to discuss it. That was when the two black SUVs turned the corner, headlights slicing through the rain like blades. Doors opened. Four men stepped out, dark coats, unmistakable outlines of weapons beneath their jackets. Amara's heart slammed against her ribs. She had heard stories about alleys like this. The kind of stories that ended in headlines nobody read past the first paragraph. Then something impossible happened. The homeless man beside her changed. His shoulders straightened. His tired eyes sharpened into something cold and commanding. He stepped in front of her without a word, and the moment he did, every gun in that alley lowered. One of the men actually took a step back. "Chairman Kang," he whispered, voice trembling. Amara's mind went blank. The man beside her, the one in the filthy hoodie, the one who had just been paid $100 like a piece of cargo, was Kang Min-jun, chairman of the Kangwon Group, the most feared, most talked about, least photographed man in Seoul's underground economy. A name whispered in boardrooms the way other names were whispered in horror stories. "Stand down," Min-jun said, voice low and absolute. The men obeyed instantly, retreating into their vehicles and vanishing into the storm as quickly as they'd arrived. Silence fell, broken only by rain hammering the concrete. Amara stared at him. "You're not homeless." "No," he said simply. "Then why?" "Because someone inside my own company is trying to kill me," he said, turning to face her fully for the first time, rain sliding down a face that no longer looked tired at all. It looked carved from something far more dangerous. "For 3 months I've disappeared, lived on these streets, watched who came looking and who didn't. I needed to know who could still be trusted." "And what does that have to do with me?" He studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. "Your stepmother just paid $100 to make you disappear," he said quietly. "I intend to find out why that terrified her enough to spend it." The apartment he took her to that night wasn't an apartment. It was the entire top floor of a building in Gangnam that didn't officially exist on any public registry. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a city glittering like scattered diamonds, art on the walls worth more than the mansion Amara had just fled, a private elevator that required a fingerprint she didn't have. She stood in the doorway, dripping rainwater onto marble floors, utterly unable to reconcile the ragged man from the alley with the empire surrounding her now. "You own all this," she said, not a question. "I own considerably more than this," Min-jun replied, shrugging off his ruined hoodie to reveal, absurdly, a plain white undershirt beneath, as if even now he refused to perform wealth for her benefit. "Private aircraft, armored transport, more men loyal to me than most small armies. Enough leverage over Seoul's elite that a single phone call from me has ended 3 marriages, 2 corporate takeovers, and 1 senator's career. That's supposed to reassure me?" "No," he said. "It's supposed to explain why I live like a ghost instead." He gestured toward a guest room down the hall. Warm light, a bed that looked like it belonged in a hotel Amara could never have afforded. "You can leave in the morning if you want. I'll have you taken anywhere in the city, no questions asked. Or you can stay until I understand why your family wanted you gone badly enough to hand you to a stranger in an alley." She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly aware of how exhausted she was. Not just from tonight, but from years of swallowing silence in a house that had never truly been home. "I have nowhere else to go," she admitted quietly. It wasn't trust. Not yet. But it was a door left open, just slightly, in a life that had spent years slamming every door in her face. She stayed. Weeks passed like slow tide. Amara learned the rhythms of Min-jun's hidden world. The coded phone calls at 3 a.m., the men who came and went through the private elevator with faces carved from stone, the way Min-jun's jaw tightened every time a certain name crossed a screen. Black Orchid Circle. She learned, too, that beneath the terrifying reputation was a man who ate breakfast standing at the window in silence, who kept a single photograph of a younger boy locked in a drawer he never opened in front of her, who flinched, almost imperceptibly, whenever anyone raised their voice too suddenly. She wasn't afraid of him, not anymore. And that unsettled him more than any assassin ever had. "You argue with me," he said one evening, watching her rearrange the books on his shelf into an order that made sense to her and clearly offended his sense of control. "No one argues with me." "Someone should," Amara said, not looking up. "Everyone around you either fears you or wants something from you. I don't want your money, and I've already survived worse than your temper." He didn't respond, but something in his expression, something that had been locked away for years, loosened just slightly. It became a pattern neither of them named out loud. Some nights, when the city outside his windows blurred into a smear of neon and rain, Amara would find him standing at the glass with a glass of water he never drank, and she would simply stand beside him without speaking, because she had learned there were silences that needed company more than conversation. Other nights, he would appear in the kitchen at 2 in the morning to find her sitting cross-legged on the counter, eating cereal straight from the box because some childhood habits refused to die even inside a penthouse worth more than a small country's economy, and he would sit across from her without a word of protest about the mess. Slowly, carefully, they built a language that belonged only to them. He taught her to recognize the difference between his real silence and the performance of it, the one he wore like armor in front of his men. She taught him that a locked door wasn't always a wall. Sometimes it was simply a room someone hadn't been given a reason to open yet. He began leaving his phone unattended around her, something his own security detail found nearly impossible to believe. She began falling asleep on his couch without flinching at every sound the building made, a small, ordinary miracle for a woman who had spent years sleeping with one eye open. Once she found him standing over the drawer that held the photograph of his brother, the one he never opened in front of her. That night, for the first time, he did. "His name was Jay," Minjun said quietly, setting the photograph on the table between them like something fragile enough to shatter twice. "He was 19. He wanted to study architecture in Paris. He never got the chance." Amara didn't reach for platitudes. She simply sat with him in the weight of it, the way no one had ever sat with her own grief, and something between them shifted permanently in that silence. Meanwhile, across the city, Madame Kang toasted champagne with Su Min in the mansion's candlelit dining room, utterly certain the problem named Amara Bennett had vanished into whatever darkness swallowed inconvenient girls. "To simplicity," Madame Kang said, raising her glass, eyes glittering with the particular satisfaction of someone who believed she had won. She had no idea the girl she'd sold for $100 was, at that very moment, sitting across from the most dangerous man in Seoul, and that he had just begun asking questions with her name attached to every answer. The crack that would split her world open was already forming. It came quietly on a rainy Tuesday, in the form of a locked necklace and a phone call Minjun wasn't supposed to overhear. The necklace had belonged to Amara's mother, a simple gold pendant shaped like a teardrop, worn smooth from years against her skin. Amara had always assumed it was sentimental. Nothing more. She was wrong. Minjun noticed it one evening, catching light against her collarbone, and something in his expression shifted. Recognition, sharp and sudden. "May I see that?" he asked. Reluctantly, she removed it. He turned it over in his fingers, pressed a small, nearly invisible seam along its edge, and the pendant clicked open to reveal a tiny data chip no larger than a grain of rice. "Your mother hid something inside this," he said quietly. They decrypted it that night on a secured terminal deep within the building's private servers. Financial ledgers, encrypted transfers, photographs of men in expensive suits shaking hands in rooms that clearly weren't meant to be photographed, and finally, a video. Grainy, dimly lit, but unmistakable. Amara's mother, younger, fierce, sitting across a table from a man Amara didn't recognize, but Minjun clearly did. "That's my father," Minjun said, voice flat with something that might have been dread. In the recording, Amara's mother spoke urgently, sliding documents across the table, warning of an operation that funneled billions through shell companies tied to politicians, corporations, and something called the Black Orchid Circle, the very name that had haunted Min Jun's every waking hour for 3 months. And then, in the corner of the frame, barely visible, Madame Kang, younger, watching from a doorway, listening. Amara felt the floor tilt beneath her. "My mother knew," she whispered. "She knew everything. That's why—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Min Jun finished it for her, voice quiet and grave. "That's why she died." The deeper Min Jun dug in the days that followed, the more disturbing the picture became. Amara's father wasn't a bystander to the conspiracy. He was tangled in it, his signature on transfers he'd sworn under oath he'd never made. Madame Kang wasn't the architect of the scheme. She was protecting someone whose name Min Jun recognized with a chill that ran straight to his spine. Someone inside his own family. For 3 days, Min Jun barely slept. He filled the study wall with printouts and red thread, connecting names Amara didn't recognize, board members, shell company directors, a senator who had once shaken his father's hand at a charity gala 20 years ago. He cross-referenced wire transfers against dates that meant nothing to Amara, but visibly hollowed something out of him each time a new connection surfaced. She brought him tea he never drank and food he never finished. And once, when exhaustion finally cracked his composure, she found him sitting on the floor of the study at 4 in the morning, back against the wall, staring at nothing. "Tell me what you're afraid of," she said, sliding down beside him. "That I already know who it is," he admitted, voice raw in a way she'd never heard from him. "And that when I prove it, there will be no one left in my family that I can trust." She didn't offer him comfort that wasn't true. Instead, she took his hand, the way she had that first night in the alley when he told her to trust him, and this time it was her voice steady in the dark. "Then you build a new family," she said, "one you choose." He looked at her for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them that neither was ready to name yet. Amara watched him absorb that revelation in silence, watched years of controlled fury flicker behind his eyes. And in that fragile, dangerous moment, she reached across the space between them and did something no one else in his empire would have dared. She took his hand. "You don't have to become the monster they expect you to be," she said. He didn't answer, but he didn't pull away either. It happened 3 nights later, while Min Jun was across the city meeting with an informant who claimed to know the identity of the person hunting him. Amara stayed behind at the safe house, curled into the corner of the window seat with her mother's decrypted files spread across her lap, piecing together a puzzle that had haunted her entire life. She never heard them enter. When Min Jun returned near midnight, the apartment was silent in the wrong way. The silence of something interrupted, not the silence of peace. A lamp lay shattered on the floor. A thin line of blood marked the marble near the window seat. Amara's mother's necklace was gone. And on the wall, written in something Min Jun refused to let himself identify, 7 words waited for him like a blade. "A $100 mistake can still be corrected." Something in Min Jun that had been dormant for years, since the night his younger brother died, since the night he swore he'd never let rage control him again, woke up completely. He made one phone call, then another. Within the hour, every camera feed in Gangnam, every informant on his payroll, every corrupt officer who owed him a favor was working toward a single goal: find her. The city that had once feared his silence now trembled under the full, unrestrained weight of his attention. The trail led, with a cruelty that felt almost poetic, to the same abandoned mansion on the city's outskirts where Amara's mother had died 14 years earlier, a crumbling estate, swallowed by ivy and silence, the kind of place secrets went to rot. Min Jun arrived expecting to find a hostage. He found something else entirely. Amara stood in the mansion's ruined ballroom, dirt on her hands, blood dried along her temple, her spine straight despite everything. facing Madame Kang, who stood only a few feet away with a gun leveled at her chest. "You should have run when you had the chance," Madame Kang said, voice trembling with something that wasn't quite triumph. "You should have told the truth when you had the chance," Amara replied, and though her voice shook, it did not break. Madame Kang's composure cracked completely. "You want the truth? Fine. Your mother wasn't killed in an accident. She was murdered because she discovered your father and I had been laundering billions through the company for years. But that's not even the worst of it." Her eyes flicked briefly toward the doorway where Min Jun now stood frozen, unseen. "Your mother also discovered his father was involved. Two families, tied together by the same rot for decades. And you—" She turned back to Min Jun, finally seeing him. "Inherited an empire built on the very crimes your father helped commit." The silence that followed was the kind that swallows a room whole. Madame Kang's finger tightened on the trigger. A single gunshot cracked through the ruined ballroom. Madame Kang crumpled to the marble floor, and for one suspended, terrible second, no one moved. Then the shooter stepped from the shadows near the staircase, and Amara's entire body went cold. Her father. "You," she whispered. "Me," he said, lowering the weapon, his voice eerily calm. "I've been here the whole time, Amara, waiting." "Why?" The word tore out of her, raw and disbelieving. "Because I orchestrated all of it," he said, and there was no shame in his voice, only the flat certainty of a man who had made peace with his own cruelty long ago. "The marriage, the theft of your inheritance, even the $100. His eyes flicked to Min Jun. "I knew who you really were the moment your name crossed my desk years ago. I knew that if I put my daughter in your path, you would eventually find the evidence buried in that necklace. I wanted you to destroy each other over it. Two families, two secrets, one bloody ending, and I would be the only one left standing to inherit what remained." "You used me," Amara said, voice breaking for the first time. "Your own daughter." "I underestimated one thing," her father said quietly, almost thoughtfully, as if genuinely surprised by his own miscalculation. "I never imagined you two would fall in love." Minjun's expression turned to stone. Every instinct honed by years of ruling through fear told him exactly what came next, that this man deserved to die exactly where he stood, that mercy was a language spoken only by the weak in the world Min Jun had built. His hand moved toward the weapon at his side. "Don't," Amara said. He looked at her. "If you kill him," she said, "you become exactly what my mother died trying to expose. Exactly what your brother's death almost turned you into. Don't let his crimes decide who you become." For a long, unbearable moment, nothing in that ruined ballroom moved. Then Min Jun lowered his hand. "Take him," he said instead, voice hard as iron to the men now filling the doorway behind him. "Alive. The world deserves to watch him answer for what he did, not disappear quietly into whatever grave he thinks he's earned." The name Min Jun had feared, the one he'd traced through red thread and sleepless nights, belonged to his own uncle, a man who had smiled at every family dinner for a decade while quietly feeding information to the Black Orchid Circle in exchange for a seat at their table once Min Jun was gone. When the arrest came, it happened without spectacle. A quiet car, a quiet hallway, a man who didn't bother denying it once the evidence was laid in front of him, because men like that only ever fear consequences, never guilt. "You'll regret this," his uncle told him coldly in the last moment before the doors closed. "No," Min Jun said. "I regret every year I let fear run this family instead of the truth. That ends today." What followed wasn't vengeance, it was reckoning. Within weeks, the evidence hidden inside a dead woman's necklace tore through Seoul's most powerful institutions like wildfire. Politicians resigned in disgraced silence. Corporations tied to the Black Orchid Circle collapsed overnight, their assets frozen, their executives arrested on live television, while stunned anchors struggled to keep pace with the scale of it. Men who had spent decades believing themselves untouchable discovered one by one exactly how touchable they truly were. Amara's father stood trial for fraud, conspiracy, and a murder committed 14 years earlier that had finally found its voice. Whatever defense his lawyers constructed collapsed under the weight of a video his own wife had helped hide, and a daughter he had once tried to erase, who now sat in the courtroom, spine straight, refusing to look away. Minjun didn't hide from any of it. For the first time in years, he stepped fully into the light, not as the whispered legend of Seoul's underground, but as a man willing to be seen, flaws and history and all. Months later, the newspapers ran a photograph that stunned the entire country. Kang Min-jun, chairman of the newly restructured Kangwon Group, standing at the opening of a new foundation, one built not on fear but on second chances, shelters for souls forgotten, education programs for the invisible. And beside him, radiant in a way no designer gown could manufacture, stood Amara. She never let anyone forget how it began. "I want people to know," she told a reporter that day, her voice steady, "that I was once sold for $100 by someone who thought I was worthless. And instead, that $100 led me to the one person who finally saw my worth." She paused, glancing at Min-jun, something warm and unguarded passing between them. Sometimes the cruelest moment of your life is also the doorway to the truest one. The city that had once feared Kang Min-jun's name now spoke it with something closer to hope. At the foundation's opening, an elderly woman who had once slept 2 blocks from where Min-jun spent his months undercover approached Amara with tears in her eyes. "He used to share his food with us," the woman said, gesturing toward Min-jun across the room, unaware of the scale of the empire the quiet man beside her actually controlled. "Never told us his name, just sat with us like we mattered." Amara smiled, watching him across the crowded room, laughing at something one of the shelter's children had said, looking nothing like the legend Seoul once whispered about in fear. She understood in that moment that the man who had been paid $100 to disappear her had spent years disappearing himself first, long before she ever met him beneath that broken umbrella. Her father's trial ended in a sentence long enough to outlive whatever remained of his ambition. And though Amara never visited him in the years that followed, she made sure his crimes were documented in full, publicly, permanently, not for revenge, but so that no one else's mother would ever again disappear quietly into a story no one was allowed to question. But peace, as it turns out, rarely arrives without one last shadow trailing behind it. On a quiet evening, weeks after the trials had ended and the headlines had finally begun to fade, Min-jun sat alone in his study, a phone buzzing softly against the desk. An anonymous message, no name, no number. He opened it, expecting nothing. What he found stopped his breath entirely. A photograph. A woman's face, older now, lines carved by years the world believed she never lived, but unmistakably, impossibly, Amara's mother. Alive. The timestamp read 3 days ago. Amara walked in a moment later, drawn by the stillness in the room. "What happened?" Min-jun didn't answer. He simply turned the phone toward her. Her face drained of all color as her eyes fell on the image, and then on the single sentence waiting beneath it, cold and quiet as a blade slipped between ribs. "Your mother didn't die. She was hiding from the people who are coming for you. Somewhere else across the sprawling, glittering city, in a room neither of them would ever have imagined, a woman watched that same photograph glow on a screen of her own. And she smiled, slow, certain, and utterly unafraid, because the $100 transaction in the rain had never truly been the beginning of Amara's story. It had only been the first page of a much larger war still waiting to be written. So tell us in the comments. If you were Amara, learning your mother might still be alive after 14 years of grief, would you run toward that truth, or would you be afraid of what it might cost you? We'd love to hear your thoughts below. If this story moved you, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's coming next. Until then, take care. And remember, sometimes the people who try to make you disappear are the ones who end up revealing exactly how unforgettable you really are.